Hey, it's Huck, and I'm taking time out today from my near total immersion this weekend into the NCAA basketball tournament, Go Buckeyes, and my attempt at replicating my mom's famous spaghetti and meatballs recipe to urge you to do something very important this weekend. As you're probably aware by now, virtually every Republican in the Senate, not to mention quite a few blue dog Democrats, are threatening to completely ignore all the calls for gun reform. Senate Leader Harry Reid has already informed us that he intends to remove two key provisions from the gun reform legislation he will introduce for a full vote in the Senate, because he can't muster even as many as 40 votes for those two provisions, those being an assault weapons ban and a limitation on the size of gun magazines. Now, it's probably true that Reid can't find more than 40 votes, and of course, in today's filibuster crazy Senate, you pretty much need to have 60 votes before you can go forward with any bill. The truth is, no Republicans, and apparently about a dozen blue dog Democrats as well, just don't feel pressured enough to go forward with some serious gun reform legislation. It's also true that Reid himself, Democrat from Nevada, has never been real keen on the idea of gun reform himself. Reid's pro-gun position over the years suggests to me that rather than to use his leadership position in the Senate to try to force some votes on this total package, well, like a lot of blue dog Democrats and virtually every Republican in the Senate, he just assumes that if the Senate will pass any old thing and call it gun reform, well, folks will be happy that something got done. Now, to give him some credit, Reid has promised that he will put universal background checks up for a vote. But even if this musters its way through the Senate, and again, it'll probably need 60 votes in order to do that, there's no real reason to believe it's likely to get through the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. This despite the fact that more than 90% of the American people want and expect this change. Now, Senator Dianne Feinstein, who authored the assault weapons restriction, has vowed to move forward with that measure. That includes the gun magazine limitation to just 10 bullets. And chances are she's going to attempt to include those in the bill in the form of an amendment. But it's clear that despite overwhelming support from the American people, virtually no Republican and as many as a dozen blue dog Democrats just aren't listening. And this is where you come in.
We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Now, if you're like me, you've been looking forward for a long time to this whole March Madness thing going on. And of course, it continues all weekend as well as the next couple of weekends. So I know it's a lot to ask to get you to drop plans to watch your game Saturday night and to do something else. But I guess that's just a metaphor for why so many things in this country that are so messed up just never seem to get straightened out. I've said it before, and it bears repeating over and over and over again. until it sinks in. Things are only going to change in America when enough people absolutely demand it. And they must demand that change with their votes, by contacting their elected representatives either with phone calls or letters or email. But most of all, they have to demand that change by real and unfettered outrage. This Saturday affords you an opportunity to unleash a little of that outrage. All across the country, host families are setting up views of Michael Moore's award-winning documentary against gun violence, Bowling for Columbine. You can visit maybe a friend in your neighborhood who's hosting one of these events, or you can host one yourself. Netflix is offering the flick free of charge to anyone who signs up for a 30-day free trial this weekend. Virtually anywhere you can download movies features Bowling for Columbine at a price of less than $3 in most cases. And after the film, you can join millions of other Americans in a conversation about gun violence with the writer and director of that film, Michael Moore himself. And I suspect one of the topics of conversation is going to be how best to publicly display our outrage at the status quo on gun violence. You know, I'm old enough to remember the early 1960s when tens of thousands of folks marched through cities in the Deep South and hundreds of thousands of folks marched on Washington. It was the great civil rights movement, and it forced Congress's hand. Finally, in 1965, they passed sweeping legislation to correct wrongs in our laws that affected minorities across this country, but particularly in the South. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was again the protests of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people at concerts, on college campuses, and in our major cities that forced both parties to rethink the Vietnam War and ultimately to end it. The sad part in all of this is that few today seem to remember that that's what it required to make real change. If you are indeed outraged by the lack of progress on gun reform, this is an opportunity for you to stand in the footsteps of those who preceded you 40 and 50 years ago, who stood up and demanded change for themselves. Is this generation of Americans up to the challenge, or did you have other plans for this weekend? Really? I'm Huck, and I'm counting on you. I'll see you real soon.